Australia is the world's smallest continent and the only one ruled by one nation. Almost everyone knows Australia is enormous in land. It's poorly populated, although few realize how much. Australian continent helps put statistics in perspective. Australia is analogous to the lower 48 U.S. states. Over 300 million people live in these 48 U.S. states, while 26 million live in Australia. California has almost 39 million inhabitants, and Texas has over 28 million, for a European perspective. England alone has twice the population of the rest of the UK. 7 smaller islands have more inhabitants than Australia, despite its continent-wide population. Despite being 60 times smaller than Australia, Great Britain, Honshu, Luzon, Mindanao, Java, Sumatra, and Madagascar, Java have roughly 6 times Australia's population. The continent gets wilder because several cities around the world have more inhabitants than the continent, including Tokyo, Jakarta, and Delhi. All have larger populations than Australia. In comparison, Shanghai and Seoul have similar populations. Sao Paulo, Mexico City, New York City, Cairo, Lagos, Mumbai, and Moscow have metropolitan populations similar to Australia. Only has 5 major cities across their continent: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide, where roughly 2 out of 3 Australians live. Australia is one of the most heavily urbanized nations in the world, with 90% of the population concentrated in relatively small urban areas that only account for 0.22% of Australia's total land area. Overall, 85% of Australians live within 50 kilometers of the coastline. This unusual population distribution causes many weird scenarios across the continent. East Pilbara, Western Australia, is one example. About the same size as Japan, it has little over 10,000 residents, half of whom live in Newman. Even though it's a little town, South Australia has an unincorporated pastoral area the size of Japan. Adelaide, Australia's 5th largest city, with about 1.3 million residents. Next to this oasis of urban life is the unincorporated pastoral area, a territory the size of France with 3,750 residents and 178 square kilometers of land per person, or 1 Aruba's worth of land per person. There's also Anna Creek. This enormous land is slightly larger than Israel but not a country or government. Anna Creek is a privately owned cattle ranch, the largest in the world, with only 8 full-time employees, according to Wikipedia. This area, the size of Israel, is usually home to less than a dozen people and 10,000 cows. Australia is empty and hammering. Also considered are Esperance on the south coast and Kununurra on the north coast. Both towns are in Western Australia, and it takes at least 35 hours to drive between them over 3,200 kilometers. The population will be less than 70,000 over that time period. This drive would take about the same time and distance as traveling from Madrid to Istanbul across practically all of Europe, where there would be many more than 70,000 people. What makes Australia so empty? How has this continent made everything I just mentioned possible? The desert, as most of you are probably thinking. Everyone knows Australia has a huge desert with hazardous creatures and insects. While this is true, who wants to live in majority of the country? I contend that it's only a small part of Australia's demographic conundrum, and the actual reason why there are so few people is convoluted. Australia is uniquely plagued geologically and geographically, being adjacent to Antarctica. There isn't enough heat to promote large-scale evaporation to form rain clouds over much of the west because cold ocean currents from the Southern Ocean pummel the frozen continent of Western Australia. Great Dividing Range, Australia's biggest mountain chain and 5th longest in the world, is in the east. These mountains extend north to south across the eastern edge of the continent, blocking numerous Pacific rain clouds. The mountains cast a rain shadow across the vast Australian interior to the west, making it difficult for moisture from the east to penetrate. These mountains aren't impressive from a global perspective, and Australia has the lowest average elevation of all continents, which makes rainfall a major issue. Mount Kosciuszko, the tallest mountain in mainland Australia, is 2,228 meters above sea level in the Great Separating Range. The tallest point on every other inhabited continent is twice that height. Nearly 3/4 of Colorado is higher than that highest mountain in Australia. This means that there are few tall mountains on the continent that can force air upwards to cool into the rain, and to make matters worse, the continent straddles the boundary of the Tropic of Capricorn, placing a significant amount of northern Australia in the tropics and almost the rest of the continent in the subtropics. The subtropical high-pressure belt that encompasses the globe warms and dries the air. So whatever air gets pushed up by Australia's few tall mountains must also deal with this phenomenon, and even more, Australia must deal with the difficult-to-predict oscillations of the southern Pacific Ocean known as El Niño and La Niña. During an El Niño event, which can last for years, the South Pacific often experiences prolonged periods of slower than usual westerly winds, which naturally causes it's no surprise that many of Australia's deadliest bushfires have happened during El Niño periods. All of these variables make Australia the driest continent with the lowest average yearly rainfall. Desert or desert-like conditions cover around 35% of the continent. This map of Australia's average annual rainfall shows that most of the rain falls on the east coast between the coastline and the Great Dividing Range in the north, which extends into the tropics, Tasmania in the south and Perth in the southwest. The map matches Australia's population density pattern except for one intriguing northern corner. Not that it gets little rain on average, but that it gets it all at once and over absurdly unpredictable times. The wet in the dry season dominates northern Australia, as it does elsewhere in the tropics. Summer rainfall is higher than winter rainfall. Darwin, the largest city on Australia's northern coast, receives roughly treble London's annual rainfall. Most of that rain comes between December and March, when monsoons and tropical cyclones are active and the coastline is excluded. In 1898, one of the area's tropical cyclones dumped 740 millimeters of rain over this small northern Australian town in just one day, more than London's average annual rainfall. That year, this town had more rain than the UK, but a few decades later, in 1924, without any cyclones penetrating the interior, it only received 4 millimeters of rain, even less than the Sahara Desert's average. Freshwater is scarce here due to the continent's irregular rainfall and the requirement for huge rivers. The Murray-Darling Basin in southeast Australia's most densely populated core is the continent's most powerful river system, but it's not a good place to create a town. System waters move southwest and empty on the south coast. As indicated, much of this basin is in Australia beyond the Great Dividing Range, where rainfall is scarce to replenish river water. The basin's average annual flow is 24,000 gigaliters, the lowest of any major river system. For example, the Mississippi Basin in the U.S. has an average annual flow of nearly 503,000 gigaliters, which is more than 22 times the flow of water that Australia's most incredible river system has. However, it's the best the continent has reached, and the basin provides drinking water for 3 million Australians while the area around it has developed into the agricultural heartland of modern Australia. Australia is one of the world's largest agricultural producers and exporters with more than 104 million, but its ancient natural challenges like unpredictable rainfall, drying rivers, droughts, and vast arid wilderness and new challenges like climate change mean it has an epic battle against its environment to continue growing its population. Due to this, Australia is the second largest sheep and wool producer and fifth largest beef producer. Australia also leads the globe in almond and lentil production and has slightly more than half of the world's certified organic cropland. Best of all, Australia's diverse cuisine is featured. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to Amazing World.